lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. These are the 7 deadly sins. Darrell Morris. Darrell Morris, when I did research about him, when I looked back at what he had written me, with all the various people I talked to in preparation for this spiking the football, the first thing that came to my mind was I needed to put a thing right here in the beginning for 2 reasons. The thing I need to put out at the beginning is Darrell Morris as a person who was not involved in pro wrestling seems like a decent human being. I'm putting that out at the front, 1, so I will not feel obligated to couch anything that I say from this point on. And 2, because I looked at those 7 deadly sins originally, and I was going to sort of force the Darrell Morris spiking the football narrative into those 7 things. And I realized that those 7 things didn't fit. So now that I've said that Darrell Morris, the human being who was not involved in pro wrestling, seems like a decent person, a charitable man, a guy who had great instincts as far as wanting to help people through his wrestling shows. I've got to say this. If we don't use Darrell Morris, if I don't use Darrell Morris and his tenure in wrestling as a teachable moment, then I failed. I think the reason the first spiking the football about Stranglehold and Eric Nelson was so effective was not only it was me fucking going off and fucking spilling the tea. That was the biggest part of it. But it was also pointing out things about wrestling that we all knew were true on some level, but people tended not to say in an overt and public way. Meaning, the tax return promoter and the guy who's too much of a mark and the guy who doesn't know what he's doing is a problem. So what I did was I came up with the 7 deadly sins in wrestling and independent wrestling and Georgia independent wrestling in particular. And I'm going to explain how Darrell Morris fits all of these things. But all of these sins aren't exclusively to Darrell Morris, meaning he didn't perpetrate all 7 of these. Some of these are things that people around him did to enable that bullshit. Let's begin. Sin number 1, playing wrestler. And this is an easy phrase to remember, but it really means playing wrestling person. In a sense, doesn't everybody play wrestler that's involved in the wrestling business? Yes, they do. However, without a system of checks and balances, without being able to restrict who comes in logical ways, or putting up some kind of barrier, even social mores in wrestling, this notion that somebody should have done something to earn a position of authority when speaking about wrestling to wrestling people. Without those things in place, what you have is Darrell Morris. What you have is somebody who got to play heel and it was fun and wasn't I good at it, and man, I've had so much fun with this shit, and nobody told this fucking guy no. Nobody publicly derided him for playing a wrestling person. That's sin number one. Sin number two, the people who let him buy a spot in pro wrestling. The first thing I ever heard about Darrell Morris was years ago when he just started pumping money in at GPW shows. And he would bring these guys in. And he was changing the very structure and nature of that show. And you know, everybody I talked to about it dismissed it as, well, you know, it's his money. And that guy booked. That guy ran a locker room without knowing a single fucking thing about what he was doing. How many people allowed that guy to buy a spot? Even guys who absolutely should have known better. In a sense, I don't blame them, because if you need the money, I get it. But it comes at a cost, and that cost is you've let somebody have authority over things that they have no earthly right to have authority about in pro wrestling, simply because they have bought their way in. And this is any number of people. I'm sure Woody, if he's being honest with himself, is kicking himself for letting this guy be an equal partner for no other reason than he bought his spot. What is the knowledge that he offered, right? Was he a great promoter? Do you think that the money that Darrell Morris spent had a great dollar spent to crowd drawn ratio? We all know that it did not. Letting somebody buy a spot is an old wrestling story. But this is a sin that needs to be abolished. And all the people, and there were a lot of quote-unquote wrestling people who justified Darrell Morris, particularly in the early days, just because he had money. And we just accepted it as that's okay because that's just the way it is. And you, Steve, you know how it is. Wouldn't you have loved to have somebody? I remember somebody asking me in relation to Darrell Morris, I believe it was Scott Hensley, who said, yeah, but Steve, wouldn't you have wanted somebody to put up a ton of money and, you know, still let you continue to run the shows your way? No, because there is no such thing. Nobody puts money into wrestling and doesn't get intimately involved with it. And then you can't tell them no. And then you can't really, you think you can guide them, you think you can teach them, but it's the very definition of selling out. Because you can't say something because they've bought their way in. And then you want the money, and then you need it. And once you need it, you'll do whatever it takes. How many people supported Doc Gayton's bullshit because it was his money and let that old man throw people around? But you know what? The second they kind of tapered that off is when Rampage ended. When they let Doc Gayton buy a spot in the wrestling world, the inevitable result was going to be tragedy. And so we have Darrell Morris. Number 3 deadly sin in pro wrestling independence: covering ignorance with confidence. People are notoriously thin-skinned. People in wrestling, their skin is thinner still. Darrell Morris perhaps had the thinnest skin in recent history in Georgia independence. Apparently, anytime he was criticized, he couldn't stand it. He let it consume him. He let it make decisions for him, which again, people couldn't stop in spite of how stupid the decisions he made, especially in the last 6 months were, because again, he had bought his way in and everybody around him allowed that to happen, right? They allowed him to play wrestler and not be great at it. And whenever he got criticized for any kind of wrestling related performance or business decision or anything else, or his public persona, or having a war with Southern Honor that he was in no position to win, or refusing the offer to let GPW continue to run in the action building, which was to their benefit, but his pride wouldn't let it happen. Instead, he was going to fight this war that he couldn't possibly win. All this stuff was covering ignorance with confidence. Darrell Morris has spent the last 6 months telling us how great he is, both in gimmick, but in reality as well. In messages to me, he bragged long and loud about how he had done all the booking and promoting and did everything for 3 years. Right? He knew that wasn't true. He knew that everything was falling down around him. But the new way to deal with everything collapsing around you is to just act like it's not. And to take credit for all the good stuff and make excuses for all the bad. Covering ignorance with confidence. How many people in wrestling does this apply to? Right now. Look in the mirror. Does it apply to you? Wasting money. Is it true that Darrell Morris was upset about Big Cass being at Southern Honor? I believe it is. I'll just say that it's kind of an unsubstantiated rumor. But supposedly he was really mad because he believed that they had a spy within his organization that was leaking things to Gary Lamb. And so subsequently Gary Lamb preempted it by getting Big Cass first, etc., etc., etc. And not only is all of that patently ridiculous, and I can, without even talking to anybody, trace how they got Big Cass at that show. But you know what the most disturbing part of the whole thing for me was? That Darrell Morris was going to bring in Big Cass. Because you know how much Big Cass was going to cost him? $2,500. Darrell Morris's entire tenure has been about spending too much money and then people justifying it. Well, no, but he has sponsors to pay for this thing and that thing. For the amount of money that Darrell Morris put in a barrel and burned, for what? For what? In Darrell Morris's mind, they went from, quote unquote, a crowd of 34, which is not true. That's not what Woody left him at all. But he thinks in his mind, we went from 34 to average of 300. By the way, that average was not 300. Wasting money. Wasting money. All those quote unquote names that got brought in. Wasting money. For what? It wasn't on production. It wasn't on long-term growth. It was blowing it on names. Or people that he perceived to be names. Just so he can hobnob. Just so he can inflate a crowd in a small way. Certainly not worth proportional to the money that was spent. How many promotions are doing this right now? How many of these are trying to recover from when they did do this? Wasting money is a cardinal sin in independent wrestling. Thinking he was being the tree of knowledge instead of sitting underneath one. He's partnered up with Woody, who's been there, done that, struggled, listened and learned, who everybody admires and loves. And I'm sure in Woody's mind it was, well, you know, I knew I could teach him something along the way. And maybe Darrell gave lip service to, I'm going to teach Woody oh so much. I mean, Woody's going to teach me a lot, and I'm going to listen. But it quickly morphed into, no, I've got something to offer. When you make a statement like, that crowd went from 34 before I got there to 300s, basically what he's saying is, Woody doesn't know shit. Nobody knows shit. The wrestlers don't know shit. They're not draws, right? Woody's ignorant. The guys who know wrestling, so the fuck what? There were 34 people, Steve, when I got there. And then I pushed it to the 300s. Me and me alone. That is direct quotes from his fucking messages to me. That's a guy who thinks others have something to learn from him, don't they? After all, he's the reason they're drawing 300. They went from 34 to 300. That was me. All me. Me. That level of ignorance and arrogance, right? Covering ignorance with confidence. All these things work together. Is a guy who simply couldn't humble himself before the process. Now, there's a number of people who get accused of this in Georgia wrestling, but the opposite is true. I've found that the guys who don't really know wrestling, at first they're pretty arrogant about it, but then they kind of run into a couple roadblocks or hear a couple of things, and then they become more open to hearing it and more open to understanding it. And it's my hope that people like David Manders, Gary Lamb, and others continue to grow and learn. Because the alternative is to thinking that you are the wrestling learning tree. And all that does is kill everything underneath. Sin number 6. Becoming a mark for yourself. Darrell Morris, in numerous conversations that I had, was a guy who enjoyed, quote unquote, being a heel. He would send messages to me where he would quote Roddy Piper and act like he was fucking teaching me, like somebody hadn't heard the fucking Piper quotes 100 times. But it was stunning. He would give me a booking lesson, right? Becoming a mark for yourself means becoming such a fan of what you are, of this persona that you're playing, that you forget that it's not real. Becoming a mark for yourself means you don't improve, and that you make yourself immune to criticism, and that you talk about haters more than look in the mirror, right? That you don't self-evaluate, you just self-promote beyond reason, right? You think it's all about you. That's what becoming a mark for yourself is. When you're not able to show genuine gratitude to the people that help you. And there were a number of people who helped. There were people who booked during that 3-year period where he said he did everything. There were other people who booked that show. There were other people who ran the locker room. And in fact, if I had to hear one more story about Darrell Morris saying something fucking wildly off base in a locker room to the wrestlers, to the boys, to the point, but what did the boys do? They just swallowed it, right? They didn't stand up for themselves until they stopped letting themselves be booked there. Finally, they went away. And that's when you knew it was dying on the vine. When people started no-showing en masse or calling out. right? Of course it was going to get to that point, but at the end of the day, they let him buy that spot. Everybody let him buy that spot, and nobody could tell him no. They didn't have a veteran presence, and I mean a true veteran locker room presence that would go, guys, he doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. Darrell Morris really embraced that heel character. But he didn't embrace it enough to really pay it off, right? Remember when I said, boy, he's got to bleed a gusher. It's got to be this big, huge thing. He's really got to pay it off. But they couldn't. They turned him face right away, right? And that whole thing was not the payoff it should have been. You can argue it was a disaster. Clearly, from everything I've heard, that Darrell Morris was looking for somebody who was going to validate, right? Someone new who was going to let him have some credibility that he'd bought and paid for. And that person was QT. QT knows how to train. QT knows wrestling. But he doesn't know how to run a show, and he doesn't know how to promote, and he doesn't know how to do any of those things that they desperately needed at that moment. Once Woody's presence was not there, once Logan Chase was just about out of the door, Darrell Morris instead looked for somebody who would validate who he was and would be happy that he was continuing to buy his spot, and that was QT. And once QT was asked to not be a presence, then Darrell had nobody except for a slew of critics that he could not help engaging with, and very few people to legitimately defend him, because the boys know that they'd let him buy the spot. Everybody around who initially sort of supported Darrell Morris because he had bought his spot successfully no longer publicly could support it, because they knew deep down, that it was bullshit, and that GPW was going down the fucking tubes, and that all the major decisions that Darrell Morris had made, going to war with Southern Honor, fucking making the show basically about himself. Now, I will say, did the real GPW thing work? It did. And was that Darrell Morris's brainchild? Yes. But he also came up with shit like the fucking Mad Hatter. What was the Mad Hatter, Steve? That's when certain wrestlers would put on a hat and it would turn them heel. Oh yeah, that fucking happened, folks. That level of wrestle crap happened. And that was also the brainchild of Darrell Morris. It was perhaps Logan Chase's last noble act that he got that nixed, but not before they did it a couple times. It's hard to tell a dog what to do once you've put a crown on its head. Oh. Once they let him buy that spot, once they let him cover his ignorance with confidence, once they let him play wrestler, once they let him become a mark for himself and he continued to find new people that would validate it when the old ones fell away, once they pretended that he had something to offer besides some money, and once they allowed him to put money in a barrel and burn it, what are we left with Darrell Morris, the wrestling person? We're left with the 7 deadly sin. Lying. Darrell Morris's last public statement which was a chicken shit thing to say in the first place, even if it was true, but it was not, was that he'd been wanting to get out for a year, implying that he was somehow noble. he was noble for sticking it out and fighting the good fight. Notice that he didn't say he did it for the boys. Notice he couldn't even pretend that, right? But that's a lie that he'd been wanting to stick it out. Everything that I had heard was he was having so much fun as a heel, and he'd never had so much fun, and things were great, right? Things were going great, and blah, 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 all during this last year. It's almost August. So what he's saying is, since last August, he'd wanted to get out. Horse shit. He wanted to get out starting about 2 or 3 months ago, maybe. Once the wheels started falling off. Because he was convinced that he was going to do this big thing with Logan Chase, and he was going to have his cage match, and it was going to be huge, and then they were going to transition to the QT era, right, where he was going to be a beloved babyface again, and he was going to have fun, and he was going to get to glad hand the fans again, and everybody was going to love him. And it didn't work out that way. Crowds continued to drop. The notion that Woody was going to possibly run shows as 515 was on the horizon. They had lost the venue. So Darrell Morris, in his last perhaps great act, besides the line of "I would wanting to quit for a year," which is fucking a lie, was he sold it to a sucker. Sold a sucker nothing more than 3 letters. GPW. The value of which came from Woody. That's the truth. Oh, Darrell Morris. I'll give that to you. You, like a few people before you in different promotions, sold something that had no value. And the reason it had no value was because of what you had done to it. But you did convince another sucker and another mark that it did have value. Whatever you sold it for, you got more than it was worth. And now the cycle continues, because now by selling it, you have done what? You've let somebody buy a spot as an owner who has no business being a wrestling owner. Is this cycle going to continue? With this new owner of GPW, are we going to let him cover his ignorance, which he clearly has if he paid money for GPW, with confidence? Are we going to let this new owner become a mark for himself? Are we going to let this new owner, who was a wrestler already, but are we going to let him play owner and shot caller? Are we going to let this new owner pretend that he has some kind of incredible knowledge just by virtue of being dumb enough to pay money for that promotion instead of learning? Clearly, we've already let the new owner waste money because he bought it. Are we going to let the new owner get away with this? These are the 7 deadly sins of independent pro wrestling, and Darrell Morris epitomized them all. Darrell Morris, I had said that Eric Nelson was a cautionary tale. I think Darrell Morris is something else entirely, hopefully, which is a teachable moment. Are we going to let it continue, everybody? Are we going to let Darrell Morris breed the new Darrell Morris? Because just because you've taken a few bumps doesn't mean you're immune to these 7 deadly sins. No, in fact, it means you probably can perpetrate them even more. Put it this way. When Larry reported that the sale was legitimate, what's the first thing you did when you saw who bought it? You probably went, "Who the fuck is that?" And then you went, did you go, "Well, that's great because it's a wrestler, so it's going to go well"? Or did you just go, "Holy fucking shit, this is a disaster"? It is an appropriate coda to the Darrell Morris tenure that he's basically sold it. And there's no hope in who he sold it to. And you know how Darrell Morris is probably going to spin it when that thing fails miserably? Well, of course it failed. I'm not there anymore. When all Darrell Morris did was plant the seeds of the failure. And now he's not going to take credit for the failure that grows from it. 7 deadly wrestling sins. But the part that interests me is how, as a wrestling community, we enabled it. We allowed it. So the only thing we can do now is learn from it and change our behavior collectively going forward. But are we going to do it? Are you? Or are you just going to keep sinning? Touchdown, motherfuckers.